Good evening, everyone. Before we commence, I just have a couple of housekeeping notices. First of all, if you could turn your phones to silent or completely off, that would be appreciated. The second thing is that the toilets are not very close to the auditorium, but are out past where you checked in, along the corridor, turn right at the green potted plant. If I could also just note, and many of you will have seen as you came in, the notice that this evening we are respecting the week of silence. We are recording this evening, but in recognition of the week of silence, we will not, and we request that audience members tonight do not post anything on social media until next week. So distinguished guests, colleagues, alumni, supporters, friends. I'm Katie Stevenson. I'm the Dean of Arts and Professor of History at Monash University. Here this evening are Monash colleagues, supporters, and members of our community, including a number of Indigenous Australians to whom Australia as a polity has done an extraordinary disservice in failing to acknowledge constitutionally that the nation-state of Australia was imposed upon the inhabitants of this land and continues to this day in an unreformed state, and that no treaty has been made with the First Peoples of Australia who have not ceded sovereignty. Whilst I don't wish to offend those observing the week of silence, I must reflect in the aftermath of the Voice referendum that it's incumbent upon us all as individuals to ask what kind of society we have shown ourselves to be, the risks that we now run in the kind of Australia we'll become, and the agency that we all have as members and friends of the Academy in healing the wounds that we have wrought upon ourselves and upon the other fundamental part of Australian life that we profess to respect, our democracy. The rehearsals of a formulaic acknowledgement of country, which ring out in meeting rooms across the land, have sat for some time on the line where they could so easily tip over into hollow genuflections of white guilt. Tonight is a celebratory occasion, and it falls upon me to acknowledge the lands on which we meet, the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Warang and Boonwurrung Boon Wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I do so ashamed by the continued acts of racist attacks my colleagues and other Indigenous Australians have had to bear in order for their ancestral rights to be retrofitted to an instrument of ongoing colonialism, and ashamed of a country which still fails to acknowledge appropriately that we continue to reinforce colonialism. But we may take modest comfort from one salutary lesson from the Voice referendum result. It reminds us in urgent terms of our duty as educators to craft citizens intellectually equipped to make informed decisions. Increased participation in higher education, in lifelong learning, and in improving the public discourse are matters in which universities can and should make a signal contribution to Australia. But while those issues and these issues are particularly prescient to what is about to follow, may I warmly welcome you all this evening to the reinstatement of inaugural lectures to the Faculty of Arts at Monash University, and to the long-established tradition of hearing directly from the brightest and the most influential thinkers of our times as they enter into the distinguished ranks of the Academy. For those unfamiliar with the inaugural lecture, it is a pleasant curiosity of university life which has a long history which predates the foundation of Monash University itself. In the depths of time, before televisions existed, and those historians amongst you will be aware of that era, but in the depths of time, public notices were placed in newspapers to invite members of the public to attend the first lecture to his students of a newly elevated professor, his inaugural lecture as that new professor. And I say his quite deliberately, as in those days it was almost invariably a man. A formal occasion marking the moment at which he had entered the highest ranks of the Academy, the new professor wore his academic robes and was presented to his audience by a senior university academic, also robed, to mark the solemnity of the occasion and its significance as a rite of passage as a university career milestone. He delivered his lecture and was celebrated for this achievement. And as is the tradition in university lectures, where questions are saved for discussion groups and tutorials later in the week, a feature of the inaugural lecture, which is also continued today, is the absence of a question and answer session at the end, which tonight we will respect, but we will also encourage you to discuss the issues amongst yourselves in the reception which will follow. Fast forward a little in time, and the public education mission of universities was developed to include an expansion of tertiary education institutions, widening participation agendas, lifelong learning departments, open universities using television and more recently online platforms to provide distance learning, and the myriad of democratised opportunities for people to gain information in the modern age. Indeed, it was 2 years after the television came to Australia in 1956 that Monash University was founded, with the first students matriculated in 1961, with a mission it carries through today of excellence and radicalism in our academic disciplines and the expansion of the education of contemporary Australians. But yet, the inaugural professorial lecture has retained its appeal across the centuries and remains a feature of the finest research institutions in the world as universities prioritise public engagement with research and, critically, access to education for all. Tonight's inaugural lecture is delivered by someone who represents everything which has changed in our society for the better. No longer the preserve of white men, the modern university is diverse in its truest and its widest sense, and our society benefits so much more for the educational and research impact that the difference in perspective and the lived experience brings to the questions that we ask of our disciplines and of our students as we develop their understanding of modern citizenship and their perspectives on the challenges of our age. Tonight we celebrate the inaugural lecture of Professor Lynette Russell, not on her elevation to professor, a rank she has held for many years, but for her elevation to the highest distinction at Monash University, of Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor. The university takes its name from Sir John Monash and is inspired by his contribution to Australian public life and his educational and civic philosophy. Born in West Melbourne in 1865 to a German, Polish, Jewish immigrant family, Monash excelled in his schooling, leaving Scotch College as dux of the school with distinction in maths and modern languages. This blend of the arts and sciences continued into his university career, attending the University of Melbourne to study engineering and arts. A man of his time, at university he joined the Victorian Rifles, commencing a distinguished military career which would see prominent service in the First World War, culminating in his command of the Australian Military Corps and being knighted on the battlefield in 1918. On his return to Australia after the war, he continued a leading role in the Victorian engineering works, military life and education, becoming chair of the then new State Electricity Commission, supervising the construction of the Shrine of Remembrance, having a prominent role in the Boy Scouts Association. He was president of the Victorian Institute of Engineers and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. The rank of Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor is conferred on no more than 10 academics at our institution and recognises Monash professors of exceptional distinction who promote outstanding leadership, outstanding academic leadership, excellence in research, education, industry and community engagement. There is a particular emphasis on criteria of excellence in guiding and developing younger colleagues and postgraduate students, in international peer recognition and in service to the university by participation in university life and holding offices of responsibility. Professor Lynette Russell was conferred the Sir John Monash Distinguished Professorship this year in recognition of her excellence, and tonight we mark this honour and celebrate her academic excellence by inviting her to deliver her lecture. Professor Russell is an anthropological historian who aims to develop an anthropological approach to the study of the past. She covers a long period of history, from the 17th to the 20th centuries, and her historical interests encompass a diverse range of subjects, including the maritime involvement of Aboriginal people, the rise of anthropological thought in Victoria, Aboriginal faunal knowledge, and museum collections. She is currently leading an exploration of the past 1,000 years of encounter history, which includes the comprehensive examination of Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, and Macassan interactions and connections with Indigenous peoples here. She has just returned from fieldwork in Macassar, working with the descendants of those mariners who travelled to Australia to fish the Trapang grounds long before Europeans arrived. Professor Russell is known for her collaborations with a range of disciplines and specialists, and she actively pushes at traditional disciplinary boundaries in order to better understand the past. Professor Russell is a committed advocate for promoting Indigenous studies as core to the undergraduate curriculum and is currently engaged in supervising several PhD and master students across a wide range of disciplines, including Indigenous knowledge systems, Aboriginal history and archaeology, research ethics, and race and racism in Indigenous health. Professor Russell's work as an anthropological historian has been widely recognised by the Global Academy, attested to by her election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Academy of the Humanities in Australia, the Australian Academy of the Social Sciences, the Royal Historical Society, and the Royal Anthropological Institute. She has been a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies for over 20 years. In 2018, she was the first arts faculty recipient of the Vice-Chancellor's Award for Academic Leadership and is listed on the university's honour roll. She was awarded an Order of Australia Medal for services to higher education and Indigenous histories in the 2019 Australia Day Honours, and in that same year was recognised by the Australian Research Council as a Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow. Please join with me in congratulating Professor Lynette Russell on the occasion of her inaugural lecture as Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor, The View from Here, Thinking about Australian History and its Future. I invite Professor Russell to the lectern.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katie. Oh, gosh. Change glasses. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Just move forward. So decades ago, I was ferrying the kids to sport, and one of the son's friends described Australia's history as boring, very long O. Nothing ever happened. No wars, no famines, no empires, nothing, just nothing. I had to concede that the history they were being taught was pretty boring. It was pretty outdated. The textbooks were divided into maybe one or two chapters of pre-European history, and then we wandered through Captain Cook arriving, his discovery, quote unquote, First Fleet, Rum Rebellion, rise of squatters, bush rangers, depressions, and so on. Well, actually, when Europeans first arrived here, they arrived on a continent in the 18th century that had been occupied for 65,000 years, home to countless generations. They encountered over 200 different language groups, more than 600 different tribes or cultures that differed to one another across geographic zones. They lived along coasts, hinterlands, travelled into the mountains. They thrived in harsh deserts, lived in great numbers along waterways and rivers. Suffice to say, all of this was long before 1788. Katie just touched on this, and it's a thing that's really quite close to my heart. How many times have you heard those standard acknowledgement of countries? The run-of-mill. What I'm going to ask you to do is something a little different. I want you to imagine 2,000 or more generations, mother to son, father to daughter, an unbroken lineage connected to the land on which we meet right here, and even where we are in this building, under or over metres of concrete and steel. Beneath our feet run the countless kilometres of coaxial and other vast optic fibre cables. It's the land on which we stand. I honour the thousands of ancestors that have gone before, and those who are still with us. May we all benefit from their wisdom, their knowledge and their courage. And I give my endless thanks to their generosity of spirit and substance. Unfortunately, to the post-European Enlightenment mind, they were simply the natives. And although they could not have not noticed the regional and cultural differences amongst groups, they simply mislabelled and called us instead the Aborigines. I first began teaching at Melbourne University as a postgraduate student in the 1990s. I taught with my much missed and much loved supervisor, Patrick Wolfe. We would always start the first tutorial of the semester with a question of names and naming. How many Native American groups can you name, we'd ask. Invariably, we'd get 5, maybe 10, 15 or 20. We'd then ask the second question. How many Aboriginal groups can you name? Usually someone would say Pintinjara or Aranda. Occasionally someone had heard of Tiwi or Yolnu. After the unsuccessful native title claim, the Yorta Yorta would sometimes come up. Stopped asking those questions quite a few years ago because society moved on. And through the hard work and activism and the constant reminders to the wider public, that we came to understand that there is cultural and regional diversity, as I see in this map. So here we are in Melbourne. We work and live on the land of the Kulin Nations, the Warang, now known as the Wurundjeri. As Bain Atwood, my colleague from the Historical Studies, in his masterful book, Possession, Batman's Treaty, The Matter of History, argues the Kulin people understood Batman's Treaty as a kind of tanderum. A tanderum is a ceremony. As I was contemplating tonight's talk, I began to reflect on how many ways public talks like this, gatherings like this, are a little like a tanderum ceremony. If you follow or have been subjected to some of the conservative media's deliberations on acknowledgements and welcomes to country, you could be forgiven for thinking that they are both divisive and a recent invention. As other scholars, including Bain, have shown, acknowledgements and welcomes should be seen as a continuation of the generous and encompassing tanderum ceremony. A tanderum ceremony was enacted by the nations of the Kulin people and other Victorian Aboriginal nations, allowing safe passage and temporary access to the use of the land and resources by foreign people. It was a diplomatic right. It involved the landholder's hospitality, the mutual and ritual exchange of gifts. Sometimes it was called the freedom of the bush. Welcomes and acknowledgements build on the foundation of these ancient rites. To see it as divisive requires a significant desire to erase the past. A tanderum is a privilege, not something to be endured, as a Tritter troll might tell you. Today, tanderums take place across the region in small and intimate groups like this and large public spaces such as that on the screen. Before I go any further, I need to address an elephant in the room, or is that in the nation? The elephant in the room, that useful idiom that means an obvious or huge topic, question, controversial issue that nobody wants to talk about. Nobody wants to bring it up because it makes them feel uncomfortable. It can be embarrassing, dangerous, controversial. Well, obviously, my elephant in the room is what happened on Saturday. A number of Yes advocates have asked us, particularly elders, for a week of silence to mark the end of the referendum. For this reason, I've not done any media this week, despite having had dozens of requests. I'm committed to tonight's lecture, so of course that goes ahead. But as we've said, it won't be live streamed, and we ask you not to tweet or put it on social media yet. I doubt there is anyone in this room that has not heard of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The statement argued for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' sovereignty and self-determination. The statement declares these concepts are based on a spiritual connection to and as first possessors of the land of Australia. The statement called for 2 substantive reforms. The first was for constitutional amendment to incorporate a voice to Parliament. The second reform was the establishment of, to use a Yolngu term popularised by Bob Hawke, a Makarrata Commission. This was to be an agreement-making body with responsibilities for developing treaty and other agreement-making processes, and then to take it back to a national truth-telling event and moments about our history, the abuses of the past, colonialism, and other issues. Together, those reforms were expressed as voice, treaty, truth. Well, we all know the first casualty of war. Lies and untruths and half-truths dominated the No campaign, and I can only hope sociologists and my colleague historians are now studying the dark and murky waters of that disinformation that sank the voice. So 5 days ago, Indigenous Australians, we asked to listen. We asked to listen at their invitation and advocate for the voice. But as we have seen, Australia is very poor at listening. The voice was to be an essential part of the national journey to remedy what Melissa Caston and I referred to as a fault line in Australian law since Lieutenant James Cook first declared British possession. It could have offered a genuine legal recognition and relationship between Indigenous communities and peoples and the nation state. Melissa and I, in our extended essay, showed that there have been sustained generational attempts right back from the first moments of first contact, made by Indigenous Australians to be heard and to be accounted for. These requests have not been rushed, and the wait has been long. This was all swept aside on Saturday, 4 minutes after the count began. The ever-reliable Anthony Green on the ABC declared the referendum decided with the No camp being victorious. The voice to Parliament could have shifted the relationship between First Nations people and the state from monologue to dialogue, from unilateral to multilateral. We believed that recognition wasn't just essential for First Nations people, it was fundamental to Australia as a constitutional democracy. The referendum to entrench in the Constitution was, in our opinion, unequivocally in the national interest. Its failure leaves us all poorer, and as a nation, we are diminished. Our international reputation has suffered, and despite what you may have read, there are no winners. But I have to say, I'm also an optimist. So at this stage, we can comfortably say that nearly 6 million Australians, allies, voted yes. Not every no was a racist no. We know that some of them were what we are calling progressive no's. And while I feel crushed, I'm also buoyed. We can see from a preliminary look at the yes and no that the more educated voters, and by extension the wealthier voters, said yes. Teals, all former LNP seats, overwhelmingly said yes. This says to me, we need better education, and that is up to us. We now have some very hard evidence that in the general populace, Australians are profoundly ignorant about First Nations people and our history. And as such, we need to call on our politicians to invest in education. We need to ask now how we as a people who have some power to speak and to be heard, well, are we up to that challenge? It's time to speak to that power, and especially in the light of lies, stereotypes and disinformation that accompanied the campaign. I like to start all my talks with the IIS Map. And it's not because it's a perfect representation of tribal boundaries, but because it fulfills a number of really important functions. Firstly, the map has played a crucial role in recognising and preserving the cultural diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. It helps highlight the vast array of distinct cultures, languages and traditions that existed prior to European colonialism. It is widely used in educational settings to teach students about the complex and diverse cultural landscapes of Indigenous Australia. And it provides a starting point for understanding linguistic and cultural landscapes of Australia before European contact. It provides evidence of the historical and cultural connections of Indigenous groups to specific regions. The map has been used in the promotion of tourism. It's prominently placed in every Qantas club, where it helps visitors locate whose land they're on. The map has been a valuable tool in promoting awareness of Australia's Indigenous cultures on the international stage. Overall, the IIS Map is instrumental in raising awareness and understanding of diversity. In the early 2000s, just out of my PhD, I wrote a book about what I called at the time the homogeneity paradigm. This was, I argued, spatial and chronological. That is, most people thought Aboriginal people were the same across the continent, but also the same through time. Well, over the interim 2 decades, the spatial element of my paradigm has increasingly fallen away, and the IIS Map has played a crucial role in this. In 2016, the Australian Bureau of Statistics census noted that half the Australian population was either born overseas or had one or both parents born overseas. That is massive diversity, and it really means that the history we tell and the history we teach must be multi-layered, and it must be nuanced. Our national story must embrace the original inhabitants, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the Indigenous histories, but it also must include migrant refugee histories alongside that of settlers or invaders, convicts and the many others. University education, we are told, is Australia's third largest export, behind only iron ore and coal. We need to be cautious about that. The figures refer primarily to the income generated by international students, and I'd venture to say that arts faculties, liberal arts subjects, and perhaps even history in particular, are rarely the beneficiaries. If we are to engage with these large groups of students, I think we need to think about ways of collaborating across our schools, across our disciplines, and indeed across the faculties. We need to find ways to make history engaging and immediate. We need to vigilantly argue for the importance of historical studies as a key pillar of a liberal arts degree. As it is taught in universities, history is the ideal means for skill development. Students acquire a broad range of historical knowledge and understanding, including a sense of development over time and an appreciation of culture and the attitudes of society, including their own. Those of us who are academic historians, who are privileged to hold university positions, also need to recognise that very few of our students will ever become historians. These are valuable skills that they will learn in themselves. They are also highly sought after by employers. Well-qualified history graduates have no difficulty in getting good jobs in a wide range of occupations, in business and finance, in public administration, in journalism, in broadcasting, in teaching at every level, or in research-based careers, or indeed in Aboriginal communities. History is not obviously a vocational, as some other courses might be, but it combines an excellent training in vital skills with a high degree of interest, and I can promise you, enjoyment. A few years ago, I was the president of the Australian Historical Association, and we commissioned Martin Crotty and Paul Senziok to undertake a study of Australian history and history teaching. In an earlier study in 1989, it had been noted that it was 450 full-time equivalent teaching and research staff in history across Australia and New Zealand. In 2016, we found that had dropped to 347, or a 23% drop, even though the number of universities had grown substantially, and of course, so had the number of students in those universities. At the time of their study, the assumption was that this drop was because Australian higher education was becoming more commercialised, relying more on business funds, international students and fee-based classes. It's also possible, I would suggest, that some of the students and the people who were advising them were wrong when they said that history or arts degrees don't lead to important work. And sadly, as we have seen, our previous Conservative government and indeed parts of the media have also been hostile to the humanities. The Australian Historical Association last year revisited the study. They wanted to see what effects COVID had also the new job-ready graduates program that the previous government had put in place. And for anybody who cares about history, particularly Australian history, it is a deeply sobering read. Since 2016, 23% less students are taking history, and the number of teaching staff has now dropped by 31%. It is likely that the Job Ready Graduates package makes students disinclined to study humanities, and over decades now we've seen significant resources taken away from subjects like history and invested in management, IT and engineering, where there are many more foreign students. This is money that we are spending that ultimately has the greatest benefit offshore. To understand the present, you need to understand the past. And Australia has a huge problem if we do not teach and research history. Think about any of the so-called wicked problems we face. Indigenous issues, closing the gap, housing policies. How do we deal with climate change? Especially, how do we become ready for bushfires? We need more than just professional skills. We need the skills that are taught in arts faculties, like how to think critically, how to be creative, how to express yourself. For a democracy to work, there needs to be a lot of people who can tell the difference between facts and crazy conspiracy theories. A student with a good history education could have easily repudiated many of the outrageous claims made by the opponents of the Voice to Parliament. As such, for example, homeowners would be dispossessed and asked to pay reparations. Can you imagine what government would possibly bring that in? The value of humanities and history in particular should not be understated or undervalued. At a federal level, having been on a number of federal government committees, I've actually seen the importance of the humanities and social sciences alongside the STEM fields. The advent of important resources like that of National Australia's Trove, and if you don't know what Trove is, go and look it up because it's the best thing in the world, has shown that the humanities can also be really high tech. The digital term that's taken place in history, which is exemplified by Trove, is also there not merely for doing the research, but it's also there for the teaching of the research. There are many ways that history and historical research is now accessed and analysed and the results disseminated. That digital revolution means we can now scour archives online, and researchers will arrive with a predetermined list of references they need, which they then usually record with a digital camera or even an iPhone. The National Library of Australia's brilliant Trove has revolutionised the way we read historical newspapers and magazines, and the digitising of parliamentary papers means travel to library to conduct primary research is not always necessary. This digitisation, though, has also changed the way we do research. In previous years, a trip to the archive would result in pages of handwritten notes, usually written with a pencil, meticulous and informative. We are now more likely to return home from a research trip with hundreds of photographed pages that have been unanalysed and yet to be understood. Although these fat files feel like you might have done the research, they are merely the beginning. I sometimes wonder if it's sped up the research process or it's actually slowed it down. This is something we need to think about, something we need to build into the way we do our researcher training. We need to theorise, we need to understand how we collect data, how we store data, how we curate it. Archives, too, are not necessarily how we once conceived of them. Dusty boxes of notes, photographs. These days, archives can be websites. Over a decade, philanthropic funding has gone into creating a marvellous digital resource. The dedicated work of my dear colleague, Associate Professor John Bradley, who is here tonight, drawing on 4 decades of forensic and extraordinary embedded, informed and community-controlled research with Yanyuwa community. He has spent the last, well, I guess it's probably well over a decade now, looking at and how we might create these beautiful animations which work both as a form of language retrieval and renewal, but also to tell the stories, to teach. They're brilliant. In a relatively recent edition of the History Teacher of Australia's Victorian journal, The Algora, They focused on the digital uses of teaching, resources for teaching. One of the things that immediately struck me when I was reading it was history teaching in high school is pretty sophisticated. It's interactive and it's energetic. The National Trust of Australia has invested strategically in digital web resources which students can access before and after they visit. There's a cautionary tale here for those of us that work at universities, and that is our students are probably expecting a lot more than we're giving them in terms of digitally engaged teaching programs. As historians, we love to tell stories. We're passionate about it. Tell the narratives of the past, build the knowledge, understand the sociology of that knowledge, and then maybe use it to create a fairer future. Crucially, in order to do that, we need to grab the attention of our audience. So, I'm going to move on to my current project. As I said, Australian history tends to start with the arrival of Europeans in 1770 or 1788. Eastern states often focus on 1770, WA 1606 or 1620s. Historians are remiss in not engaging with archaeology and deep time, with some obvious outstanding exceptions such as Grace Karskens, Anne McGrath, and some of those amazing young scholars who are coming through in that new and exciting environmental history movement. I majored in history and archaeology before I pursued a history PhD. So I've always been interested in the connection between history and archaeology and indeed anthropology. I'm really interested in how those disciplines connect and how they can reinforce each other. So I'm going to argue that it's time for us to move away from the short stories of the past and consider more ambitious histories, a kind of longue durée, if you will. For Australia in particular, it's entirely appropriate. The fields of history and archaeology have been for far too long seen as separate disciplines. We need to reconsider that. There remains a powerful barrier between historians and what we understand to be the past and the knowledge generated by archaeologists or geneticists or botanists who work also on the past, on a different type of history, just not archival history. There can be a perceived danger in this sort of collaboration, a threat to epistemological purity. I'm convinced that the best history, the most engaging and accessible, breaks those boundaries, both disciplinary and cultural. I'm constantly looking like an eclectic forager through archives, materials and narratives. So in Australia, perhaps more than anywhere else on earth, it is possible to do a truly integrated deep history. European colonisation is relatively recent. The ill-named prehistory covers 99.9% of the continent's history, while the earlier period of pre-European history, contact history, remains the purview of archaeology. I remain optimistic that we can create a deep narrative. However, we need to loosen our disciplinary boundaries. Students who major in Indigenous studies almost invariably include archaeology or anthropology if it's available, while other history majors rarely do. This includes Australian history majors. Many archaeology majors around Australia include history units, while few history undergraduates take classes in archaeology. But in order to write that deep history, we need to be rigorous in our use, our definitions, and our language, especially the notions of progress, intensification, or evolution. All cultures develop, they accumulate knowledge, they move forward. On this, I think most of us would agree. We might part ways where we know, or we think we might know, where those cultures are going. So over the last decades, I've shared this passion for a deep time of Australian history, one that would radically shift our historical consciousness by concentrating on the dynamic awareness and the dynamic history of the encounter between First Nations people and outsiders for over a millennium. I'm building an encounter history built on First Nations experiences of that intrusion and the long history of outsider fascination. As Katie mentioned, we're thinking about the Dutch and the Spanish, the French. We're also, of course, thinking about the Macassans. We've been examining First Nations textual records for encounters with outsiders, and we are collecting Indigenous knowledge and traditions of arrival of people from the sea, We are seeking to incorporate the perspectives of the agents of European empire, Northern and Southeast Asian commercial interests, and Melanesian mariners. We've recently undertaken a trip to Makassar, where with our Indonesian colleagues we've been exploring the long relationships between Aboriginal people from Northern Australia and South Sulawesi. Whoops, that went back. Sorry. Our most recent publication suggests that it's a much longer antiquity than previous work has suggested. And I think our 1,000 years is probably pretty good. We know that European archival records are rich. There's over 400 years of Dutch records, but they haven't been accessed as nearly as much as we'd like them to. But in addition to those traditional archives, we're examining evidence for linguistics, botany, archaeology, material culture, rock art, oral traditions, and scientific evidence such as that provided by geneticists or medical historians. We call our project Global Encounters. Global Encounters is reframing our national story. We are placing British encounters within a deeper history of global intrusion and exploration. We are avoiding the trap of politicisation as we are developing narratives that are not merely about colonialism and colonisation, but about encounter. Rather than the British colony, which problematically for Indigenous people begins in 1770, with Cook discovering Australia, this is a history that documents 1,000 years of encounter and interactions where Indigenous people exert their agency and respond to newcomers on their own terms. It then puts that 18th century British arrival at the end of a long series of interactions. As part of our engagement, we've been working with our colleagues in the Faculty of Information and Technology, and we're developing an interactive website we're calling our Cultural Gateway. Its interactivity means that it will actually be able to be accessed and added to by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people if they want to add their stories to our website. And these are some of the boats that our wonderful IT colleagues have been building for us. And because it kind of has a virtual reality component, you will be able to stand on the ship and see the shore coming towards you, but you'll also be able to stand on the shore and see the ship. So in order to tell that truly epic story of Australian history, we need multiple perspectives and voices. Fundamentally, we need Indigenous people and Indigenous historians. We need to incorporate theirs, ours, perspectives into the national story and together write and celebrate the extraordinary history of an extraordinary continent. But before I sum up, I'm going to acknowledge a few of the giants, the many giants upon whose shoulders I stand. I've already mentioned one with Professor Bradley. Many historians and Indigenous studies colleagues at Monash have given me so much I am extremely proud. I'm humbled by their brilliance and their collegiality, and in particular two who unfortunately are not there tonight, Professor Christina Toomey and Professor Jackie True, whose friendship has sustained me through some extremely tough times, and I'm very grateful to both of them. I'm also grateful to Professor Katie Stevenson for the honour of this lecture and to the University for granting me a Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor. Also to my family, especially to Tim and Miles, David and Luella, for always being there for me and continuing to seek the truth. My greatest debt, however, is to Professor Ian McNiven, my partner in life and work. Ian is a scholar who practices impeccable ethics, whose research is without doubt world class, whose passion for understanding the past is matched only by his commitment to social justice. I'm very thankful that he's prepared to share our jam-packed, crazy menagerie of a home and work together. Over the past 2 decades, with astonishing speed, things have changed. I have not even scratched the surface tonight, but here are a few significant moments from the last 4 decades. We have had protests around the European bicentenary, after which Keating's Redfern speech morphed into the reconciliation movement. We saw the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. We saw the Bringing Them Home report. We have felt the impact of Mabo and the subsequent native title legislation. We have seen the diversity of First Nations people emerge and become vernacular. More recently, we have seen the emergence of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and now we have witnessed the failure of the Voice to Parliament. Here in Victoria, we have the Yurok Justice Commission's truth-telling process and treaty discussions with the First Peoples Assembly. In South Australia, starting in March 2024, a state-based voice to Parliament will conduct elections for its members. A First Nations Treaty Institute and official truth-telling and healing inquiry has been developed in Queensland, and there's also a Minister for Treaty in Queensland. And finally, in New South Wales, a Minister for Treaty and the state ALP committed to funding and commencing treaty discussions as an election promise prior to winning government in March this year. All of these are bound to impact the way we think about our history going forward. As a society, we have matured. We can think about our history and reject the notion that capital H history starts in 1770, and we can include 65,000 years of Aboriginal history. What the next decades might bring, I am under no doubt. The future will be co-designed and co-produced. As a mature nation, Australia must tell its epic story with multiple voices, multiple perspectives. We need Indigenous people, and as I said, we need Indigenous historians. But crucially, it's not merely 65,000 years of stasis, which only changed with the arrival of the Europeans. Over that vast time frame, there were many significant events and phases. Some 10,000 years ago, the sea level rose, drowned up to a quarter of the continent. Tens of thousands of people would have had to need to relocate. Less than 4,000 years ago, the dingo arrived, almost certainly as a semi-domesticated companion animal. 6,600 years ago, the ancestors of the Gunditj Mara built the world's oldest aquaculture system. Local pottery has been made on the islands of the Queensland coast between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. Languages across Australia changed in the last few thousand years. Tamarind trees were introduced to Northern Australia as Macassan sailors brought with them the seed-laden tarty fruit that they used to season their food. And perhaps 50,000 years ago, mung beans from Southeast Asia were introduced to the Australian continent. This would be the earliest known evidence for people deliberately moving plants from one place to another. Along with the fire stick farming and other land-based practices, our country was sustainably managed, and this is our history. Hopefully, as we continue to tell the stories of change over time, the Australian public will come alongside, and they will realise that it has been anything but static and unchanging. Over time, we will write histories that are deep and wide, but we will also celebrate the local, the small scale, and the specific. If you've been listening, you will have heard multitudes of elders across the nation who are willing to share their stories. If we can listen and incorporate their perspectives into our national story, if we can listen, we can definitely write this together, something that we can celebrate. As I said, the extraordinary history of an extraordinary continent. But what we need to do next is for them, the elders, and all those Aboriginal historians out in communities to be properly resourced. They need to be supported to continue with their generosity and for the rest of the country to listen. We were asked to listen as a nation and we failed to do so. So now it is imperative because the very soul, the very history of our country depends on it. Thank you.
Congratulations, Professor Russell, on your inaugural lecture and your elevation to Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor. Guests, I would like to invite you to join us in a moment in the foyer for a reception and to continue discussion on these subjects. But before we do so, please join with me one last time in congratulating Professor Russell.